Hey, what's up, Inquirers? Today's video is the fourth installment of the preliminary hearing series in the Ahmaud Arbery case. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. You are watching Inspiring Inquiry. Alright, so in this video, what I'm going to be doing is going over the defense attorney for Roddy Bryan's arguments as for why there never should have been an issuance of the warrants. Now, in past videos, I've kind of referred to him as Kevin Gow, but in this interview, I heard Agent Dow refer to him as Kevin Goff. So from here on out, I'm just going to take him at that because they seem to have a prior relationship, that I'm just going to refer to him as Kevin Goff. So according to Kevin Goff, he starts out by asking Agent Dow whether or not there's any evidence of racial animus on the part of Roddy Bryan directed towards Ahmaud Arbery. And Agent Dial says that as far as he knows, there is no evidence of racial animus towards Mr. Arbery directly. So to follow up on the answer that he was looking for, he then shifts it to ask whether or not there was racial animus played a part in the events that took place that day, at least on the part of Roddy Bryan. To which the special investigator asks him, well, are you asking for my opinion, or are you asking if there's any facts about the case that lead to that? So, Kevin Goff says, well, we'll start with your opinion. He'll take his opinion because he is the investigator. To which Investigator Dial says, yes, it did. Now that he got his opinion, he wanted to move on to whether or not there was any evidence to lead them to believe that race had played a role in the actions that took place that day. As to the evidence, the special investigator says that there were certain communications that he found between Roddy Bryan and others that indicated that there was a reason that race played a role in his actions. That he seen a man running down the street who was being chased by other men, and he made certain assumptions based on his viewing, his perspective of what he seen going on. That seems to have directly led to some of the actions that he took in this particular case. Now, among the other defense attorneys, when they asked particular questions, they were implying certain things when they asked those questions. One thing I noticed about Kevin Goff is he implies a lot of things. So after they talked about the communications that Roddy Bryan had and why that led him to believe that race did play a factor based on the evidence, that there was evidence of that, he asks him, the special investigator, whether or not he is familiar with implicit bias. Well, what is implicit bias? Implicit bias is a subconscious bias that people have regarding certain stereotypes given in society. The way that we look at people, the way that we view things based on appearance, based on past stereotypes that we may have become familiar with. And Agent Dial replies with that he's not a lawyer, so he's not familiar with it, and they quickly move on. Well, the reason that I wanted to pinpoint on him saying, are you aware of implicit bias, is because it's implied that he's using the idea of implicit bias to say that the actions taken by his client, Roddy Bryan, were due to the fact that it was implicit bias, a subconscious bias that he may have had towards the given situation. Now, I want to put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that in a minute once some other questions are asked and some other evidence comes about. We're going to see whether or not implicit bias should have ever been interjected into the conversation whatsoever. They go on to talk about how Roddy Bryan was compliant with the GBI and how he voluntarily gave up certain information. And this is also another note that is hit on several times in the questioning. He's already setting up his defense for his client. Even though this particular hearing isn't a defense of the law, this particular hearing is a preliminary hearing to determine whether or not there was enough evidence to issue the warrants. Once we go to court, that's when they're going to be able to argue for the law. There's a difference between arguing for a certain interpretation of the law and going over the facts of the case. When you issue a warrant, it's based on certain criteria that need to be met in order to do that. In Travis McMichael's case, it was him pointing the weapon at Ahmaud Arbery. In this case, it was the actions that he took to directly block Ahmaud Arbery from being able to escape. Now, in the trial, they're going to go into why they committed those actions, and a jury or judge is going to be able to decide then whether or not they were justified in those actions. But if you do make certain acts to prevent somebody from leaving, that is detaining them against their will. And that calls for the issuance of the warrant. They talk about how Roddy Bryan was compliant in giving up his social media records over, I think it was about the last 5 years worth of social media posts that he had made and things that he had responded to. Kevin Goff asks him whether or not there was any posts of a racist nature on social media. Agent Dow responds with, no, there wasn't anything on social media that he found. but he did in fact find things on his phone. Now Goff asks him what are some examples of the things that he found on the phone, to which Agent Dial says that he's seen several comments that were racially derogative. As an example, he gives one where Roddy Bryan was apparently at an airport where he was messaging somebody and says that there weren't that many blank up here. Now we just talked about implicit bias and what that means. That was the first time Kevin Goff tried to excuse racism by his defendant. Here's the second time. This is where he talks about how different life experiences can shape the way that people view the world. And he asks the agent whether or not he agrees with that, to which obviously the agent says yes, that he agrees, but it is implied here that he is saying that the reason that he is saying these particular things is because of life experiences that he has had. So he's basically saying that his client is a racist based on his life experiences. Then he goes on to say how there were thousands and thousands of texts and social media posts and all of those things, and that there were several derogative statements, but only out of thousands of text messages. Once again, trying to minimize the racist acts by Roddy Bryan. Agent Dial says yes, out of several thousand, but that there were several of the comments and that he didn't have an exact number on how many there were. And once again, in the same line of questioning, we are touching on the third time that Kevin Goff tries to excuse the racial nature of his client's statements, to where he says, well, comments like these are not all that uncommon in the South now, are they? And Agent Dial says that there were terms that Roddy Bryan used that he has never even encountered in his time before, so he can't really speak to the generality of how common these things are in the South, or anywhere for that matter. Then they go on to talk about the palm print that they found on Roddy Bryan's truck and whether or not they were able to identify who it was from. The SI says that he collected palm prints from Roddy Bryan and his fiance to go ahead and rule them out, but it's kind of hard seeing how it was several months ago that Ahmaud Arbery was shot and it's just now being investigated. I don't know whether or not they're going to be able to get a palm print from Ahmaud Arbery. But according to the special investigator, they haven't been able to rule Ahmaud Arbery out yet. Once again, Kevin Goff touches on how compliant that Roddy Bryan has been with the investigation. Then Kevin Goff moves on to Ahmaud Arbery's car, to where the SI says that he hasn't been able to locate the car, that the car used to sit in front of Ahmaud Arbery's mom's house, but that it frequently died and he would have to get jumper cables and jump it off. To which Kevin Goff says, well, I was just trying to make sure that it wasn't full of other people's stuff, implying that Ahmaud Arbery was a thief, that the special investigator needed to know where his car was so he could determine whether or not it was full of other people's stuff. Once again, trying to build up a defense for his client as to the actions that he took, when this preliminary hearing isn't here to determine why he took those actions, but that he took those actions. Now, if I haven't said it before, I really don't like Kevin Goff. I really don't like him at all. This is the part where he tries to bring up conspiracy theory now in the preliminary hearing. So he refers to the stick scenario, or the stick narrative, the hammer conspiracy theory, where he asks whether or not they identified that he was carrying a hammer. And Agent Dial says that there were claims of a hammer, but that when his specialist took a look at the video, he concluded that it wasn't a hammer, it was a stick. What people were calling a hammer, what they were saying that Ahmaud Arbery was carrying around and threw at the last minute, it was a stick. And they didn't even show whether or not he was carrying this item. And Agent Dial said that after reviewing the footage, he didn't see any evidence that he was carrying anything. Still, pushing on with this narrative, Kevin Goff asks whether or not they logged a stick into evidence that day, where Agent Dial says no, they did not log a stick into evidence. Pushing even further, Kevin Goff then asks, so we don't have any fingerprints from this stick? To which, again, Agent Dial says, no, we don't have any fingerprints of the stick. They go on to talk a little bit about the autopsy and whether or not it uncovered anything that was pertinent to the case, any more evidence or facts about the case, and he said no, there wasn't anything in the autopsy that told them anything more than what they already knew. They go on to talk about whether or not there were any other videos or eyewitnesses, to which he says no, it was Roddy Bryan, Gregory McMichael, and obviously Travis McMichael that were the witnesses to the events that took place. Goff then asks whether or not there's any evidence to show that Roddy Bryan was armed, and Agent Dial says that no, there isn't any evidence to show that, but that he was allowed, he makes sure to note this, that he was allowed to leave the scene before he was ever checked for anything. Now at this point, Goff brings up the polygraph test that Roddy Bryan had took and whether or not it showed that there was consistency that Roddy Bryan wasn't armed, to which the prosecutor steps up. Obviously, he objects. I don't know if everyone knows this, but for the most part, polygraph tests aren't admissible in court, or at least in the state of Georgia. I guess that there are some special circumstances in which you can use evidence of a polygraph test, but for these purposes, it wasn't admissible in court, so he objects, to which the judge says, okay, but we need to, that he'll let him ask that particular question, but to move on with it. Agent Dial then says that he doesn't know of any evidence to refute the claim that he was unarmed. He then asks whether or not there was any evidence to show that there was communication between the parties whenever this event took place, to which Special Investigator Dial says that no, he doesn't see any evidence of that. Moving on, they talk about how Officer Minshew came over to Roddy Bryan's, how they cut down the video and was trying to upload it and how that failed. We talked about that on a past video. He asks the agent whether or not Roddy Bryan has been consistent in his statements, to which he replies yes, that he has been for the most part consistent. And not missing a single chance, Goff once again touches on whether or not his client has been forthcoming with the information, how willing he was to give up this information. This time, particularly in reference to the statement that he claimed Travis McMichael made, the racist statement that Travis McMichael made after the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery, but before the police had got there. He asks whether or not they asked him specifically about that question, or whether or not Roddy Bryan brought it up to them, to which he says that it was Roddy Bryan that brought it up. And once again, without missing the chance, he offers up the question whether or not, without the help of Mr. Roddy Bryan, that these facts could have been lost or undiscovered in the case. To which the special investigator says that he has no way of knowing whether or not that's true. They talk about his motor vehicle and how he gave consent to search the vehicle and search the house and how compliant that he's been the entire time. Then coming to the part where they talk about the recreation that Roddy Bryan went out with officers to do on the path of travel that day, which path he took when he left his house to the time of the shooting. Now, while discussing how hard it is to ascertain the path of travel that day, Kevin Goff refers to the events that took place that day as chaos and asks the special investigator whether or not chaos is a good word to use to describe those events. I'll go ahead and play you the clip now of his response.
And even for a trained police officer, it is hard to articulate the chaos of that day.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And is chaos a fair description of what was going on out there that day? One vehicle is going one way, another vehicle is going the other way. They're not in communication with one another?
I would say, I don't know if I would use chaos, pursuit, hunt, something along those lines.
Those were the words you would use?
That's the words I would use, yes, sir.
Okay. We'll come back to that.
I don't think he ever came back to that, but we'll move on anyways. Now he starts pushing for the defense that things are not always as they appear. They start talking about how fast he was driving whenever he was filming that video, that apparently the video makes it seem like he was going a lot faster than he was actually going. And then they agree that he was going about 15, 20 miles per hour, that it was at a slow rate of speed. Then they start moving on to the distance traveled that day. They talk about how far the distance was that people traveled in this whole interaction here. And he says that that is also misleading, that when you look at it on a map or you start talking about it, that it seems farther than what it actually is. To which Agent Dial somewhat agrees that it could be a little bit different than the way that it actually is, but that he's not really sure if he really understands the question that he was asking him. Now, in order to illustrate a point, he brings out this big giant poster board and puts it on an easel. And basically what he's trying to do is illustrate for the people in the court, for the judge, using Special Agent Dial and this poster board of how much involvement that Roddy Bryan had in these particular circumstances. We're going to see why he's trying to do this later on, dishonestly, I might add. I will go ahead and say that he's being very dishonest, and we're going to explain why he's being dishonest when he does that. So it pretty much looks like this. It's a line drawn down the paper with 2 lines drawn at each end, basically representing the start and the end of the events that took place. They're going to try and plot a timeline for when things happened so he can illustrate how involved his client was. Now, they go back and forth and kind of quibble over when the start time was. They talk about going based off of the 911 call, which is what Agent Dial says is the best time to go by, because that has a better timestamp that is more reliable than the security footage that was caught from across the street or the security footage that was caught in the English home itself. So he wants to go by the 911 call. But Kevin Goff wants to start this at when Ahmaud Arbery entered the house. This is faulty, and we're going to talk about why it's faulty in just a minute after we've explained some more of what he went through. So on the first mark, he asks him to go ahead and draw the time 1:04 to represent the time that Arbery went into the house and the starting of the entire event. Remember, we're going to come back to this later. Then, using the 911 call made by Greg McMichael, they set the shooting timeline at around 1:15. Having these two times established, they then talk about when Roddy Bryan's involvement began, and they talk about how it started whenever the men ran right in front of his house. Goff claiming that Roddy Bryan lived a considerable distance from Greg McMichael's house, to which the special investigator replies, well, what do you mean by considerable distance? Because it's kind of a relative term. It means different things to different people. He clarifies that to him, considerable means that he just can't see what's going on at Greg McMichael's house from his own property, which it was kind of around a corner a little bit, so that was reasonable. They then discuss how much time it took from the time that he got involved to when he started filming driving in his truck, to which the special investigator says there's no way that he can't really determine that, but that it doesn't start until he's on Holmes Road. Then he asks him, well, how far did he have to drive? To which the special investigator says he doesn't know exactly. They go on to make an approximate time that the video footage started filming in relation to the starting and the end of the event. Now that he has the timeline established the way that he wants it, now he asks the special investigator whether or not it's fair to say that Roddy Bryan was really only involved in the events that took place for about the last third of the entire incident. The special investigator says that he's not sure if a third is fair, that maybe more so about half of the events, to which Kevin Goff replies that he's missed half the action, using the words action in this instance. Now, you can say that, oh, maybe that was the wrong word, but it just kind of puts you into the mind frame of how Kevin Goff is looking at this particular incident, where Agent Dial says that to say half is fair. But now that we have Kevin Goff's timeline established, we're going to tell you exactly what is wrong with this particular timeline. First off, he starts it as when Ahmaud Arbery entered the house, or a guesstimate of when Ahmaud Arbery entered the house. Because if you're going by the 911 call, then that was a few minutes after he actually went in. But all of that is irrelevant, because what we're discussing in the preliminary hearing is three men's involvement into this interaction. And when Ahmaud Arbery was in that house, it had nothing to do with these men becoming involved. A lot of people try to conflate the two events to make it seem that Ahmaud Arbery going in the house actually had some bearing on those men going after him. No, according to all the evidence, according to all the statements, Gregory McMichael and Travis McMichael had no idea that he had ever went in that house. So to start a timeline of events when Arbery entered the house is dishonest, because that has nothing to do with the preliminary hearing. It had nothing to do with their involvement. So he's saying that these are the events that took place and this is the best place to start. That is false. The best place to start is when the three men on trial in the preliminary hearing who had the arrest warrants issued on them, when they became involved, is what's relevant. What Ahmaud Arbery did is completely irrelevant. That's like going up and saying, well, it really started when he got up out of bed that morning. Secondly, when he talks about how Roddy Bryan only participated in the last third, and then they cut that down to maybe half of the action, as he referred to it as, they're wrong as well, because it doesn't start whenever he starts filming. It starts whenever they drove in front of his house and Roddy Bryan became involved. So what he's basically doing is he's lengthening the timeline, and then he's moving Roddy Bryan's involvement from here up to here to say that he only took place in the last third or half, but yet he's starting it way back here when it should be started up here. And instead of it being right here, it should be back here. So then it would show that actually he's involved for a much larger portion of this entire event than he would like to let on. And he's using this particular illustration, drawn out the way that he wants it, to try and prove a narrative that just doesn't fit the evidence. But now that we tore that shit to pieces, let's move on to the rest of his garbage arguments. And it just gets worse from here. Now, moving on from the timeline he established, they start to cover the attempts at blocking Ahmaud Arbery from leaving the neighborhood. Now, the special investigator says that when Roddy Bryan went to pull out, according to his statement, that he was going to turn left to go down the direction that the men following Ahmaud Arbery were going. But whenever he went to come out, he was going to turn left, but apparently seen Ahmaud Arbery coming at him, and that's when he decided to pull straight out and, quote, block him. He says that Ahmaud Arbery ran around his truck, and they marked this as the first attempt to go ahead and block him. Now, this is key because Kevin Goff goes on to try and establish each time that he blocks him. Now, after they establish the first time, when he pulls out in front, straight out, and blocks him, he moves on and asks the special investigator, okay, what was the second time that Roddy Bryan attempted to block Ahmaud Arbery, according to him? To which the special investigator says that in the statements that he read, in the interview that he had with his agents, he didn't go into those kinds of details, that he said that he pulled out that first time, and then he made several more attempts, according to his own statement, to block Ahmaud Arbery. Now, after asking that question and getting that answer, he continues on talking about it and asks the same question again, to which the special investigator gives him the same answer. And then they go on talking about it a little bit more, and then Kevin Goff once again asks the same question. What was the second time? To which the special investigator says again that he was not aware of those kinds of details, that when he had given the interview that he didn't tell him what the exact second time that he attempted to block Ahmaud Arbery was, that the special investigator doesn't know, and he isn't aware of any statements that he made of particular instances in which that he did that. He asked this question several times, and the special investigator answers it several times. So much so that the prosecutor actually has to get up and say, objection on asked and answered. He's asked it and answered it several times, to which even the judge says, yes, that question has been asked several times and answered 2 or 3 times, to just move on with it. Now, this brings us to the most absurd framing of the evidence. Kevin Goff asks him about his earlier testimony given by Agent Dial, to where he references the evidence given, the testimony given, as an attempted carjacking. The prosecutor rightly objects on this based on a mischaracterization of evidence. Now, the special investigator said that Roddy Bryan feared that Ahmaud Arbery might be going to try and grab the handle, but that he never grabbed the handle, and that he just thought that he might be going for the handle, that's what his feeling was, but not that he actually ever did or ever even attempted to carjack Roddy Bryan. Kevin Goff says that he's going to ask it a different way, to which then he just basically asks him, what do you call this thing, and defines a carjacking. Let's just play the clip so you guys can watch.
And on March 13th, when the GBI interviewed, he indicated on both occasions that Mr. Arbery, for whatever reason, looked mad, looked angry.
I don't recall that, Counselor.
You don't recall that?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, of course, if a bunch of white people that you didn't know were chasing you around with cars and guns, you might have reason to be mad, right?
Are you talking about me or Mr. Arbery?
Any young black man in South Georgia being chased by a bunch of white guys with guns would have reason to be mad, wouldn't they?
Just have a call for speculation, obviously.
I'll rephrase.
Yeah, please do.
Mr. Bryan indicated that he felt threatened by Mr. Arbery's actions. Am I correct?
I believe he felt that Mr. Arbery was going to try to open the door, if that's
Okay.
your question about that part.
Right.
Yes, sir. But
Now-
then again, he also then continued to pursue Mr. Arbery, and we're basing it on Mr. Bryan's statement to that effect.
Okay. And you dispute that a reasonable man sitting in Mr. Bryan's shoes at that moment in time would have probable cause to believe that his motor vehicle was about to be stolen?
Objection that would call for speculation as to what his client was thinking.
Sustained.
Is there any question in your mind that Mr. Bryan was himself personally authorized under Georgia law to effectuate a citizen's arrest for carjacking and for attempted theft of a motor vehicle and attempted assault and battery after the incident with Mr. Arbery on the side of the road?
Objection twofold. One, it mischaracterizes the evidence, and two, that's really a question of law and a source of argument, but not a facts question in terms of what this court must do in judging probable cause for the issuance of the arrest warrant.
Sustain the objection.
This right here is a blatant example of how dishonest this man is. He takes an instance where Roddy Bryan is trying to block Ahmaud Arbery with his truck, so much so that Ahmaud Arbery actually made contact with his truck and left cotton fibers along the bed lining of that truck. He takes it where Roddy Bryan says that he feels that Ahmaud Arbery may have been going for the handle of his truck, to Ahmaud Arbery attempting a carjacking. So the fact that he said that he was afraid that Ahmaud Arbery might get in the truck, he is now trying to take that and use that as a way of saying that he felt like he was being carjacked. Never mind the fact that he's already involved at this point. He's also trying to use that to justify what he considers to be a citizen's arrest. This is already in progress. He's already chasing Ahmaud Arbery and committing a crime by doing so. And so he's now trying to take Ahmaud Arbery's actions of trying to get away from him as some sort of evidence of him being able to effectuate a citizen's arrest based on what he felt like Ahmaud Arbery was going to do. Well, I'm sorry, whether or not you're Travis McMichael, Gregory McMichael, or Roddy Bryan, you cannot conduct a citizen's arrest for what you feel like is happening. Whew. Okay, so that's all I'm going to cover in this video. As you can see, Kevin Goff is really dishonest with the way that he presents the evidence. He tries to make it fit a particular narrative that he seems to be coming up with after the fact. And as frustrating as it was to watch, it was a lot of fun to pick apart. I really appreciate you guys watching my video. Be sure to come right back here for any more videos. Subscribe to the channel. If you haven't already, like this video, share this video so others can see it, and comment down in the comment section below. Whether it has to do with the case, whether it has to do with this video in particular, I would appreciate any and all thoughts. As always, you guys are watching Inspiring Inquiry.